In just a few weeks, we will be in the midst of celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike, where thousands of workers walked off the job, initially to support the traditional bargaining demands from some of the city's established unions, but eventually to demonstrate a more systematic challenge to the social, political, and economic status quo, which reigned across Canada in the aftermath of the Great War. But this is all so far away from us today, isn't it? Aren't the efforts of those working class and socialist activists, however storied, a relic of the past? What can it all mean in an age like ours? Turns out, a heck of a whole lot. The strike took place in the spring of 1919, in a context of deep socioeconomic strife. The end of the war led to unemployment, which was exacerbated by veterans returning from the European front. This war was not only meant to end all war, but to usher in a just social order. As we know, neither happened, and this left many Canadians dismayed. In this context, building and metal trades workers appealed to the Trades and Labor Congress Council in Winnipeg to support them in a general sympathetic strike to win key demands such as recognition of their bargaining units. The result, no doubt driven in part by a climate of social injustice, led to most of the city's working class population striking and shutting Winnipeg down. This led to a coordinated counterassault as the Canadian State, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, the Winnipeg Press, a special group of police officers which were basically scabs replacing the strike-supporting city police, and the city's elite organized into the shadowy Citizens Committee of 1000 worked to successfully break the strike by demonizing quote-unquote alien elements among the strikers and by arresting its leaders. In this way, the strike could be deemed a defeat, at least in the immediate term, as capital reasserted dominance over the city and didn't meet the strikers' demand. But such is not the case, and in both the short term onward, the strike led to positive reforms, the rise of new labor organizations, and the birth of new political parties. Beyond this comes the reality that the lessons of the strike apply still today. Indeed, the strike remains relevant, not just because it stands as a crucial watershed in the history of Canada's labor and left movements, but because the very things that make the strike special speak to some of the challenges that continue to face working people. And given massive inequality, along with a multi-generational assault on the rights and expectations of working Canadians, it may well be the case that the lessons of Winnipeg are as relevant today as they have been at any point since the end of the Second World War. First, a key element of the strike was that while it started with a basis among Winnipeg's craft union establishment, it quickly spread to cover nearly the entirety of the city's working class, union and non-union. This was crucial because only a small portion of workers in the city and country belonged to unions at the time, and this was before the widespread advent of industrial unions which aimed to organize the broad masses of working people. By building a strike untethered to formalized union membership, the strikers demonstrated power rooted in the universal concerns of the working class. Today, there are more workers unionized than in 1919, and those unions are much more recognized, established, and well-resourced. Still, the majority of working people do not belong to a union, but still have a desire for a more secure and dignified life. So while the role and demands of traditional unions have enduring value, we also need to recognize that groups like the Fight for 15 are doing essential work to bring improved workplace standards to all Canadians, even if they aren't covered by a collective agreement. In their actions, they are upholding one of the core principles of Winnipeg 1919. Second, the strike was a moment of inter-ethnic solidarity among Winnipeg's working people. Even though there were real divisions between the city's Anglo-Canadian workers and the growing population of immigrants, largely from Eastern Europe. Indeed, most of Winnipeg's unionized working people belonged to the relatively exclusive craft unions, which were indifferent at best and often hostile at worst to the growing immigrant population from non-British Isles countries. Despite this, the strike unified working people in the city against the capitalist class, whatever their nationality or citizenship status, which caused existential terror among the elite. In this way, they launched attacks against strikers by disproportionately targeting the city's immigrant class, who were deemed to be part of a subversive, quote-unquote, alien insurrection against venerated British traditions and institutions. This has a multifaceted relevance today, largely because workers in our own time are still divided by race, religion, and citizenship status, which allows a much more tight-knit capitalist class to perpetuate its power. As it was in Winnipeg, it must be understood by workers today that if we are to build a more just society, the victory can't just be won for and by Western European Canadians with citizenship. It must include all working people in this country, settler or indigenous, permanent or temporary, racialized or not. But while there is a need for a more comprehensive solidarity amongst workers, we must grapple with the reality that challenges, be they contemporary or historical, are not born equally, and as such, those of us with greater legal, social, and economic security must stand for the rights of others. Building off of this, Winnipeg was special, paradoxically, because it wasn't a purely unique event. The strike must be seen, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a national and even international revolt. The experience of the Great War and its immediate aftermath sharpened the class analysis, which rolled out across Canada, with labor revolts taking place from Victoria to Amherst, Nova Scotia, with political parties uniting farmers and workers for the first time, with leftists and trade unionists protesting across much of Europe and the United States, and with a socialist revolution in Russia that inspired working people the world over, even if they didn't all agree with the specific aims and outcomes of that revolution. Simply put, Winnipeg 1919 has to be seen as part of a global movement, however much it stood out admirably as a particularly potent example. Finally, we must remember Winnipeg as a general revolt against capitalism broadly defined. In some ways, there may be a desire to whitewash the goals of the general strikers, making the event more palatable for modern audiences and governments, who want to harness the legacy of this foundational event, but don't want to reckon with the fundamental aims of said event's actors. To be sure, many if not most of the strikers were not in favor of violent overthrow of the Canadian state by Bolshevik means, and all wanted a total transition away from the systems of private property and market economies. But neither was this merely a demonstration for meager reforms within a capitalist rubric. This was a broad endeavor for a new social order, and while the strikers didn't all agree on what that order would resemble, they all stood in opposition to the stark economic inequalities, the failures of private control of major industry, the lack of democracy within and beyond the workplace, and they stood in favor of a general idea that the basic human rights needed to trump the narrow and unaccountable desires of profit and of capital. Today, we can see much of the same thing. Many of us have real issues with the state of our society, and while the solutions aren't always held in common, there is a sense that a deep unfairness pervades most every nook and cranny. The strike, and the general labor revolt, was valuable because it channeled the broad discontent into a critique of capitalist society, and so today, we need a coalition of the left and labor to do much the same. Certainly, the voices in that coalition will disagree on a great deal, but they must insist on a common program which will find mass appeal among the broad working class. 100 years later, much has changed. It would be hard to argue that Canada isn't a more humane and just place overall, but we can't hide the fact that we still have unfinished battles left over from Winnipeg 1919, and the general labor revolt it was a part of. This year, there will be various memorials and conferences dedicated to studying and commemorating the strike. But crucially, these events are also taking the opportunity to look forward and see how we can do the legacy of Winnipeg proud over the next century. The women and men who put it all on the line in 1919, they deserve nothing less. So thanks everybody for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. This is kind of a distillation of some of the thoughts I've written down in other places. Part of this is covered in a recent foreword I did for a new edition of kind of the workers' history of the Winnipeg General Strike, which I've published with Lorimer. If you want to see the cover, I've posted it up here on the screen. I've also posted a link in the description. Be sure to pick up a copy of that. It's a fantastic resource about how the workers themselves interpreted the events of the strike, in the years following it. If you like this video, please like it, comment, subscribe, share it with your friends. Be sure to look forward to more historical content on this channel, as well as other stuff. Again, I cover contemporary left politics, and I also talk about things like The Simpsons from time to time. So if you liked, left content broadly defined, you'll find it here, and I'll see you next time.